I was a little boy when I saw my first eagle. It was the coolest thing. I heard the call. I felt a sense of freedom, a sense of wilderness, of hope. It gave me goosebumps. It's the call that symbolizes Africa. It's the call of Africa's most spectacular eagle, the African fish eagle. My name is Munir Virani, and I've been studying these eagles for over 20 years at Lake Naivasha, a very special lake in the heart of Kenya's Great Rift Valley, home to one of the world's biggest concentrations of wildlife. Naivasha has grown into one of Kenya's greatest economic miracles, having some of the world's largest flower farms, a geothermal power plant that supplies half of Kenya's electricity, and a rapidly growing human population.
But this story is not about the lake. It's about the African fish eagles and how they are coping with the pressures caused by man.
I think without exception, everybody who lives around the lake is absolutely shocked at what's going on.
I don't see the future. It doesn't look bright.
A whole lot of things have changed, not all of them for the best.
Well, fish eagles, you know, even today the fish eagle numbers are just still amazing.
There are so many poachers.
When people realize the effects of what they are consuming, then they will seek alternative fish to consume.
And I would say that the biggest threat now is the people themselves.
We found DDT as well in all of the samples that were collected and analysed at Lake Naivasha.
All those birds have declined by over 75%.
There's many
Such a point that the acacia woodlands
have to
now
do.
largely
The impact of lead on
We
animals
just
and
don't
human
have
beings
those
These young
is well
greyfish, for
documented,
instance,
and it is said that high levels can cause bone defects.
Lake Naivasha is the highest freshwater lake in Kenya's Great Rift Valley, with a dynamic, exciting, and somewhat tumultuous history. It is recognized as one of the world's top 10 birdwatching sites, having a unique biodiversity that includes the highest concentration of African fish eagles in the world. But Lake Naivasha has undergone severe and dramatic environmental, climatic, and human-caused changes over the last 100 years. As a result, there have been corresponding changes in biodiversity, landscape, water levels, and socio-economics. Despite these pressures, Lake Naivasha has an unshakable resilience that enables it to support an incredible wilderness and a thriving economy. In Africa, no other bird has come to symbolize elegance, majesty, and splendor like the African fish eagle. In African mythology, the fish eagle is known as Tai and is traditionally revered as the keeper of the waters, The African fish eagle is the quintessential flagship of African lakes and rivers, and its call is symbolic of the African sunrise. That eagle over there, I call her CF. She's a spirited and determined female. We tagged her in 1997 as part of a banding program to understand why fish eagles were not producing chicks in the mid-1990s. She has been around the block a long time, at least 20 years as an adult. She has seen it all, the good times and the carnage. Last year, she successfully raised 3 chicks and has always raised multiple chicks year after year. There is something really special about her. Fish eagles are apex predators and prefer water bodies that are clear and shallow with thriving fish populations. They nest mainly on tall trees that overlook the water. At Naivasha, fish eagles breed around May and usually raise 2 chicks that leave the nest after about 4 months. Juveniles are dark and scruffy, and it takes them up to 5 years to get the gorgeous adult plumage. Fish eagles normally hunt in long, shallow dives and prefer snatching fish from the surface. Like all birds of prey, fish eagles are renowned for their excellent eyesight, being able to see forward and sideways at the same time.
Yeah, I did this experiment once with a group of students further up the lake, and the boat was a good, almost a kilometre away from the shore, and there were a pair of eagles sitting on a perch, about 30 metres high, and we had a small tilapia, about 3 or 4 inches long, small brown fish, same colour as the lake, and I dropped it out of the boat on the other side of the boat, so they couldn't see it. As soon as the boat left the scene, they were off the perch and straight at that fish. So their visual acuity is about 8 to 16 times our own.
Fish eagles are capable of seeing fish in the water from several hundred feet above, while soaring, gliding, or in flapping flight. This is quite an extraordinary feat, since most fish are countershaded, meaning they are darker on top and much harder to see from above.
In the late 1960s, the late Dr. Leslie Brown pioneered fish eagle studies around Lake Naivasha. After that, he published his magnificent and classic book, The African Fish Eagle, which paved the way for future biologists and researchers to study this magnificent eagle.
I first met Leslie when he was living in Karen, and he had a pair of crowned eagles near his house. And every now and again, he would come to Naivasha to count fish eagles. And a number of people like myself, we were in our early 20s then, 2 or 3 of us would often come with him. And he would take us all out in his boat, and we would count fish eagles. Some of us would stand on the shoreline for an hour or so, and he would go around the lake in his boat, and we would make a count of fish eagles on that particular day. And then we'd all meet up in the evening. We'd camp on the lake shore.
I was with Leslie Brown, who was at that time one of the biggest gurus. So about 1976 or 77 or something, I used to go here on occasion. I do think I sat on the famous boat of his that was parked at Alan and Joan Root's house. And he would like to go out there and pretty much just sort of drink and watch the sunset go down and look at his eagles, his fish eagles.
When Leslie Brown did his studies here, he counted over 250 fish eagles around the lake. He also found that there was a very healthy ratio between adults and young birds, suggesting that these birds were doing fantastic around the lake.
Understanding why fish eagles were thriving on Lake Naivasha, we need to go back in time to the end of the 19th century.
This lake has had a very long history of water fluctuations. In 1884, when the explorer Joseph Thomson walked across Lake Naivasha, this lake was virtually dry, except for a little pond right in the middle of the lake.
After just 10 years of when this photo was taken, heavy rains caused a lake water level rise of up to 6 meters, which resulted in the lakeshore expanding by 8 kilometers from the center.
They put it in historical context though. There are pictures here, I think, taken in the 1920s, 1930s, where you look out across what was then hardly anything of a lake, and there were no trees. It was an open plain. So obviously the fish eagles weren't as numerous.
Historically, rainfall has been the main driver of the fluctuations in the lake's water levels. In 1925, non-native fish species were introduced in the lake to enhance sport fishing. Tilapia were first put in from nearby Athi River to produce food for the American largemouth bass, introduced later at the suggestion of former US President Theodore Roosevelt, who believed that it would help sport fishing here. By 1945, the lake was at its lowest with a level of only 60 centimeters. And by 1967, Naivasha's lake level came up by 7 vertical meters, spreading over kilometers and transforming it into a paradise for birds and other animals.
It was quite unbelievable. It was just as Joseph Thomson said in 1883, that lake is a moving mass of water birds. And that's exactly what it was, particularly in the early 60s. It was a moving mass of wildlife. Water lilies, it had the most stunning scenery. Birds by the thousands, ducks by their thousands, herons, egrets, jacanas were just everywhere. And so it was a birdwatcher's paradise. And people who came here just simply couldn't believe it.
It was very, very different from what it is now. The water was absolutely clear. If you went fishing, you could watch the fish following your lure in.
The lake was slightly bigger than it is today. The water was much clearer. There were thousands of coots that used to be on the lake.
Those are some of the memories you have of the early days of Naivasha. This crystal clear water, these immense numbers of birds.
What changed?
Explosion of human population.
In the early 1980s, Lake Naivasha began to change from the growth of 2 important industries that needed lots of water: horticulture and geothermal energy.
One of the biggest extractors of water from Lake Naivasha is Kenyan. They need the water for drilling. The old power station uses lake water to cool the turbines. But I don't believe they do anything. They give the lake back anything.
Kenya's first geothermal power plant was developed southwest of Lake Naivasha, producing 45 megawatts of energy. Today, geothermal power produces half of Kenya's electricity. At around the same time, Naivasha's horticultural farms also began to take off.
One of the people who just actually take water from the lake, they are flower farms.
And the horticulture industry started setting up in the early 80s. And by the mid-1980s, you saw the establishment of greenhouses all along the shore of the lake. In those days, they were just taking the water direct from the lake.
From humble beginnings, Lake Naivasha now supplies 20% of the roses sold in Europe and 70% of the United Kingdom's market, making it a multi-million-dollar industry for Kenya. There are more than 60 flower farms in the Naivasha Basin, employing more than 50,000 people.
To them, Lake Naivasha offered abundant fresh, clean water, over 300 days of sunshine a year, and only 2 hours from an international airport where they could export their produce, be it agriculture or floriculture, flowers. And that just increased and increased and increased.
In 2014, Kenya's flower industry raked in nearly $600 million. But this top GDP earner for Kenya came at a price.
A lot of people say that the horticulture and agricultural industry lowered the level of the lake by 4 meters.
But the two industries attracted a stream of people flocking to Naivasha in search of jobs. The impact was dramatic.
Lake levels went down, and at the same time, we saw the town sewage was pouring into the lake. I think it's now 15, 16 years where the sewage has just poured into the lake 365 days a year. That has totally destroyed the lake.
Because of the human population, we have more villages with absolutely no sewage treatment at all. So it's good old-fashioned long drops, and that finds its way into our shallow aquifer that extends a long way back, which finds its way back into our lake.
Yes, I agree. They have been having serious challenges in managing the sewage in totality, because you still find some sentinels finding their way into the lake.
And these effluents provide rich nutrients for algae blooms that deplete the lake of its oxygen, thereby suffocating it.
You have this issue always of having pollutants going in the direction where we can have, a red-brown algae, which is quite dangerous for our wildlife species as well as livestock.
Some of these algal, blooms can be poisonous. What usually happens when you have a major algal bloom, then you create this anoxic condition in the water. And we have had cases of such where even there are fish kills.
Right.
Like in 2009 we had that.
There was a lot of rotting at the lake bed, and this gave an indicator to probably what had caused the fish kill.
I've seen the fish bury up several times, especially before the lake came up. There was a time the lake went down and then came up. Just when it went down, in fact, there were hundreds of fish that died.
As more and more people flocked to Naivasha, more sewage entered the lake and more water was being taken out of it. The pressure on the lake and the fish eagles was building.
In 2009, Lake Naivasha was at its lowest level, the lowest it had ever been in 60 years. In fact, the water level that you see over here was out 1 kilometer, just a little puddle at the back over there. And because fish eagles need perches to hunt efficiently, they had to adapt to novel ways in order to get their food. And one of the ways they did that was by perching at the backs of hippos.
But all the people working around Lake Naivasha needed to eat as well, and so fishing also boomed, both legal and illegal.
The numbers of fishermen, both legal and illegal, increased 10-20-fold. And one of the biggest problems has been the proliferation of nets all over the lake.
Overfishing is a problem because we have the overfishing, we have poachers also, and we have seining. We call it corrosion. There are so many poachers, but the poachers are just coming from within.
I would tell you that one of the biggest menaces that we have in Lake Naivasha is illegal fishing, what we call the unlicensed vessels. Where illegal, people out there in the bushes, make wooden vessels that do not have any color, and they hide them in the bushes, and they use it for purely illegal fishing. What we are doing about that is that every day we are able to organize for patrols.
We joined one of the county patrol boats and their chairman, Daniel Onyango. He explained to us that every single day they seize and destroy undersized fishing nets, confiscate illegal fishing boats, and with the help of the fishing community, deter unlicensed fishermen and arrest fish poachers who are then prosecuted and fined. But the overfishing still goes on a massive scale, with the disastrous consequences for the papyrus plants lining the shore. The papyrus belt is a critical filtration system that has declined by nearly 80% over the last 4 decades.
The papyrus belt was the lungs of the lake, the life support system that this lake had. But as the papyrus got eaten away and destroyed, every time it rained, all the silt, sludge, garbage came into the lake, and it's still doing the same now, 10 years later.
There are more and more people around here. There's more and more need for water. There's more and more nutrients flowing into the lake, causing turbidity. And there's more and more industry and farming around the lake, which means a lot of the big trees have been taken out, which is what they use for their nests. There's many, many problems that these poor fish eagles have to deal with.
What was the difference in fish eagle densities between pristine and degraded habitat?
Well, the difference is actually quite staggering, and that's the major threat, habitat destruction. So around where we are now, where we have lush acacia woodlands, nice steep shores, the density is about 5 eagles per kilometre. But then when you go to the side of the lake where there's complete coverage of flower farms, riparian trees have been raised down to the ground, that goes down to 0.5 eagles per kilometre. So the density in good habitat is 10 times more.
And yet, despite the rapidly changing and degraded environment, the fish eagles continue to thrive. Whilst habitat loss affected fish eagle density, one invasive species had already caused havoc on the lake, and the fish eagles were not spared.
It's a destructive beast and should be eradicated.
If there's any creature that has caused irreparable damage to Lake Naivasha's ecology, then it's this little guy over here. He looks small and he looks harmless. This is the Louisiana crayfish. It was introduced in the early 1970s to enhance the fisheries of the lake, but boy, did they cause havoc.
The Louisiana crayfish, for instance, has eaten out all the submerged macrophytes, the underwater greenery. Without that, the coot, the small black coot, no longer is here in the numbers that it used to be. And that means that with the turbidity, the fish eagles can't see the fish. So their next favourite dinner is a nice little coot, and that's pushed off because there's no greenery. And they're actually in trouble, despite the fact there are so many around here.
Crayfish has a very good market in China. Chinese people like crayfish. And this year, the county government was trying to engage a few people to export crayfish to China.
The combination of an overfished lake with very few water birds meant that the African fish eagles had very little to eat.
In 1996, the African fish eagle population at Lake Naivasha had reached its all-time low of 67 individuals. That was a drop of 75% of when Leslie Brown did his studies in the late 1960s. The lake at that time was also completely overfished. The fish eagles were barely sustaining themselves, let alone get into breeding condition. We then started a banding program to understand how these fish eagles were surviving and whether this lake was acting as a dying field for these magnificent eagles.
Our banding studies showed us that African fish eagles spent an enormous amount of time fighting one another. And at least 15% of the dead birds that we found were killed by other eagles to maintain their territories that were highly contested.
Well, the biggest threat of any species is its own species. If you have a whole load of lions around here, you can bet your boots you're going to be getting a whole load of injured lions from fighting and territorial disputes. And eagles are no different. There's no doubt that there seems to be a huge increase in the number of attacks made on each other.
At the moment, have a real problem releasing birds because there are so many birds on this lake, there's no spare territory. And if I were to release a bird now, it'd probably be killed straight away because there's nowhere for it to go.
The frequency of fish eagle fights increased as their population went up by 40% following heavy rains and a rise in water level in the year 2000. And ironically, it was yet another invasive species that helped the fish eagles recover.
As the lake water level rose, this guy over here, the common carp, found his way accidentally into the lake. For the very first time, Lake Naivasha had a bottom-feeding fish, one that stirs up the sediments, that eats all the submerged plants, and destroys the nests and eats the eggs of other spawning fish. This carp over here caused havoc. He's huge, but the fish eagles love them.
Because the carp are bottom-feeding fish, a number of scientists began to record alarming levels of heavy metals concentrating in the carp.
I was looking at the concentrations of cadmium, copper and lead in surface sediments, water and the mussels of common carp at different sampling points within the lake. The most striking result was that in fish mussels, lead was 100 times higher than what is recommended for consumption.
And where did all this lead come from?
Many years ago in the 1940s, there was a lead mine above Gilgil, quite a flourishing lead mine. And the owners of the lead mine every day flushed everything down the Gilgil River, and that ended up in the lake.
So what does high levels of lead in the fish, water and sediments mean for the people living around the lake?
It is said that high levels can cause bone defects, they can affect reproduction, and they can also generally be carcinogenic, affect nervous system, etc. These are just some of the effects related to this. So health-wise, this is what the impact will be. In terms of socio-economics, we know that common carp constitutes over 90% of the fishery in Lake Naivasha. So when people realize the effects of what they are consuming, then they will seek alternative fish to consume. And this will affect the fishermen in terms of earning from their livelihoods from the fish, from fishing activities within the lake.
Heavy metals were not the only industrial pollutant that caused concern. With the flourishing flower industry now well established along the shore, the public wanted to know where the harmful pesticides were ending up in the lake.
This one affects our community because they throw some chemicals to the lake.
One such pesticide was DDT, which was banned in Kenya in 1986. But pressure mounts for its use for malaria control. DDT causes eggshell thinning in birds of prey, causing eggs to be more brittle, and so fewer chicks survive.
Lake Naivasha is, kind of a hub for floriculture and horticulture activities, and so there's been a lot of concern over, how those practices are run and whether they're affecting the lake and the biodiversity around it.
The horticultural activity, we don't know what they're putting in the lake. Could be all kinds of pollutants affecting eggshell thickness, etc., development of chicks.
Nobody wants to believe it, but I still think it's going on. The larger flower farmers, many of them don't use those type of chemicals, and they are concerned about the lake. But unfortunately, they're lumped in with everybody else. There are the irresponsible ones as well as the responsible ones.
I cannot really criticize or comment so much on pesticides finding their way into the lake. Most of these flower farms really takes care of what gets back into the lake, and I really commend some of them.
It was not surprising that there was, we found DDT as well in all of the samples that were collected and analyzed at Lake Naivasha. So that could have been because there was still some leakage from somewhere, or someone was still using DDT in the environment, or it could have still been residues left over from past uses.
How did these levels of DDT in Masumi's samples compare to what is acceptable by World Health Organization standards?
Luckily, the samples that we analyzed of the fish eagle blood was nowhere near what it used to be in terms of causing eggshell thinning and impairing reproductivity. They were very sort of low levels that were found, but I guess the concern is that when you start having lots of these chemicals that are being concentrated in one species over a long time, there could be other, issues manifesting that we wouldn't know until much later.
The fact that African fish eagles are regularly producing chicks at Lake Naivasha suggests that organochlorine pesticides such as DDT are not a problem at Lake Naivasha today. But are there still new pesticides in use today that are harming the lake?
I know that there have been such concerns over the years, but most of them, like you said when you're asking that question, is that they are unsubstantiated. What happens is that the flower industry is a very visible thing in Naivasha, and as such has become a very good punching bag. Anything that happens, then you can always blame it on this good punching bag that you can hit anytime. But that actually is changing over the years when people and also scientists like yourselves have come and done researches here, and they found that some of those allegations are not founded at all.
In the year 2010, after the worst drought in 60 years, Naivasha's health was in critical condition. There was public outcry for the Kenyan government to step in. So they launched Project Imarisha, a beacon of hope where everyone for whom the lake mattered got together to ensure the future survival of Lake Naivasha.
Imarisha is a government initiative which was started in 2011. And the purpose of Imarisha Naivasha was to initiate a sustainable development program within the Lake Naivasha basin.
Local NGOs helped mobilize the community.
Well, since the mid-90s, WWF has been working in the basin, working specifically with communities, so developing governance, water governance with the communities and natural resource management. And what we do is we provide them with support, like financial support, through the buying of seedlings, for tree seedlings, as well as Napier or cocksfoot grass for contouring. And then we also train them through the Ministry of Agriculture on how to actually develop the contours, maintain the contours, and manage their farms better. So this way we have reduced the amount of soil erosion. We are starting to see very good change in water quality and livelihoods, of course, is the PES, the Payment for Ecosystem Services Scheme. Now that was started and was initially supported quite well by the Lake Naivasha Growers Group. And without them, we wouldn't have had this success story.
Even private industry got into the act.
Over the years, what LNGG and various growers have done, we've been trying to adopt good agricultural practices. And apart from that, also, we've been looking at our way of using pesticides and treatment of water. Most of the growers now have adopted closed system hydroponics, which means that any excess water in the greenhouse is usually recycled for reuse. And as such, there is no runoff or any pesticide that come out of the greenhouses into the environment. Our core business is to look at the sustainability of the industry in this area. And when you talk about sustainability, we must talk about environmental care and conservation efforts to ensure that we're not depleting the natural resources that we're using at a rate that we don't use them at a rate that is not sustainable.
And that matters to the next generation more than anybody.
Tell me what is different from here in your home or school?
In this place, there are a lot of animals, wild animals.
One of our big success stories is creating conducive environment for learning in schools through eco school projects, whereby environmental clubs in schools try to nurture green patches in their schools, small habitats for birds, small habitats for small animals and insects, for them to enjoy, that is one, and something else for them to interact with nature, to know how they need to relate with nature. And lastly, for their teachers to use the outdoor as a learning tool.
Do you feel you're creating future conservationists, future leaders in conservation?
Yes, I believe that we are creating future leaders because with the current schooling system, it's whereby children are now being given leadership roles. Usually in schools now there are presidents and there are secretaries and those, and they're able to, children are now exercising their leadership roles in school, which I believe when the transition is progressive enough to high school and universities, there'll be better future leaders who are able to influence decision making and they're able to lobby for their rights.
Does the lake have a future?
Everybody asks, despite all the pressures, the fish eagles are doing well currently. They've gone through ups and downs. Despite all the pressures of water abstraction, human population growth, industry, the industrial park coming through, the SGR and everything. Does Lake Naivasha have a future?
It does need a lot of people who care to fight for it, or we will lose it.
I would imagine here in the next 50 years or so that Lake Naivasha will still exist in some form, and nature is incredibly resilient. It will find its way.
I don't see the future. It doesn't look bright. I expect in 50 years, even if the lake will be there, it will be very much polluted.
It is very possible that my grandchildren will still see Lake Naivasha. But there is need for, a lot of effort in conservation, in awareness creation, in restoration program.
The future is very uncertain, I'm afraid. I don't think the lake will ever come back to what it was in the 60s and 70s. I think those days are gone.
Lake Naivasha's future is in our hands. We as the people living around the lake, conservationists, scientists, policymakers.
I think so, because over the last 30 years, the species composition in all facets of this lake, all the fish, all the water plants, etc., they're all invasive and they've changed the lake hugely. This lake used to be crystal clear, but now it's turbid, you can't see below the surface, and that's as a result of crayfish and carp coming in and such. So one could argue that the lake is at its worst condition possible, but the eagles and wildlife is doing rather well in the places which are protected.
During the making of this film, both lake levels and numbers of carp were up. And in my 20 years of study, I had never seen so many fish eagles as I did in 2016. They obviously had a lot of food to eat and a community that loved them, and that's why they were thriving.
So the numbers of eagles have more than doubled to about 240. And that goes back to the numbers recorded by Leslie Brown in the 60s and 70s. So the lake is at carrying capacity for the eagles and they're doing fantastically well. Most pairs have 2 or 3 juveniles.
The future of Lake Naivasha and its people, and indeed of the fish eagles, hangs precariously in the balance.
Perhaps the eagles will still be here 20 years from now, their evocative call shattering the dawn silence. But for now, the eagles are doing well. High water levels have brought in an abundance of fish, and there is still good nesting habitat. But what gives us greatest hope is the goodwill of the local people to save the lake. But as man continues to exert more pressure on this lake, the eagles will have to find new ways to adapt. Lake Naivasha is not just a place of beauty or a place of financial gain. It is a place of inspiration, a place of hope, a place where man and eagle must come together to use the lake wisely.